So the first tip is that we want to make the habit more easier or more difficult to engage in depending on if it's a good or a bad habit. So if we want to build a good habit, we need to decrease the friction between our intention of actually engaging in that habit and being able to take action on that habit. And if we want to break a bad habit, we want to make it more difficult to engage in that bad habit. So for example, James Clear noticed that he started at some point in his life consuming more beer than he actually wanted to. Then he had the idea, because he used to place his beer in the front of the fridge, and because he knew about how our environment actually shapes our behaviour, he then decided to not put the beer in the front of the fridge but at the very back where he could hardly see it. This actually led to him consuming way less beer, which made him think, how much does our behaviour actually depend on how much we want something? Do we actually just take action not necessarily because we necessarily feel like we want or need something, but because it's just more convenient? And another thing he did is to eat more healthily, is that he wouldn't have apples too often, and he wanted to change that. So he put apples somewhere where it was really easy for him to see, and that actually led to him eating more apples and therefore becoming healthier. Another great way to make habits easier, and this would lead me to the second tip, would be what James Clear calls the 2-minute rule. So basically the 2-minute rule is basically just taking a habit you want to build and saying that it's enough if you just do it for 2 minutes. And this is really helpful because it really helps against procrastination, and especially because the first step is the most difficult step. So starting to do a task is actually way more difficult than actually doing the task itself, which is why the 2-minute rule makes us then feel less overwhelmed by the task and makes it easier for us to start. And in most cases, once we've started, we actually feel like, oh, this isn't that bad at all, I could go on for longer, and then we tend to actually do it for quite a long time. But most people don't start in the first place because they expect too much of themselves and expect to do a habit for way too long, and therefore it feels so overwhelming and they don't do it altogether. And the reason why most of us set expectations that are actually way too high is that we somehow think that our future selves are going to be better than we are right now in the present. We somehow think that, oh yes, my future self, they're going to do everything right, they're going to do everything perfectly. I think the reason why we do that is because when we think about the future, we don't think about the times when we're going to be tempted. However, in the present, it's obvious that we're tempted because we feel it right then. But somehow we think that in future everything is going to be easier, which of course it isn't. In fact, the only people who don't have this optimism bias are people who are depressed. In a study, it turned out that American college students think that they're going to be more likely to have talented kids than they actually are. And they also think that they're going to travel to Europe much more than they actually will. And this just goes to show how we think that our future selves is going to be so much better, and that we're going to have it so much better in future. What's also a big problem with setting goals that are too high is that we don't measure our progress by looking at how much progress we've actually made. Instead, we compare our progress to how much progress we expected ourselves to make. So that means even if you are making progress, if you set goals that are too high, you actually feel as if you didn't make any progress, and you actually feel worse about yourself. And if you know anything about habits, a habit consists of the trigger, the routine, and the reward. And if instead of rewarding yourself, you punish yourself for not doing as much as you actually wanted to, that is going to lead to you not engaging in that habit anymore in the future. And then the third tip would be what James Clear calls the 2-day rule. So basically what the 2-day rule says is that you can miss one day of, for example, not exercising when you intended to, or engaging in any other good habit you wanted to, but you can't miss 2 days in a row. And this 2-day rule is really good against our all or nothing mentality. So basically what an all or nothing mentality is, if in case you don't know, is, for example, when it comes to diets, many people fail because they tell themselves that either they're going to manage all the time to resist temptation, or they're just not good enough to manage. With that mentality, once someone who's dieting, for example, wants to eat a cookie, they might feel tempted and then they eat that little cookie, and instead of stopping, they tend to eat way more than they usually would, simply because they feel, and this is what also Katie Milkman calls the what the hell effect, which basically is that, okay, so now I've already failed, I've broken my diet, I might as well eat as much as I can now because I've already failed anyway. And also because of kind of moral licensing, that if you've done something for a long time successfully, you then feel like, okay, I've already done this for so long, and I'm going to behave much worse than I usually do simply because I've been so good, kind of thing. In a study by Katie Milkman with 38 different exercise programs in which the participants were paid for going to the gym, one of the best methods to actually get them to exercise more regularly was increasing the incentive a day they actually did manage to exercise. And by increasing that incentive, it makes them prevent what most people do when they go to the gym, is basically they go quite regularly in the beginning and then they miss a day and then they think, okay, I'm not going any longer, and then they just stop entirely. And this is really stupid because sooner or later we are going to come across setbacks. It's inevitable. And if every single time we miss a day, we then miss lots of weeks in a row just because of that one day, that is really, really bad for our habits and our progress. And this leads me to the fourth tip. It's really satisfying to kind of see these chains of us taking consecutive action, because it makes us feel like we're being really consistent, and as human beings we really like this kind of feeling that we're consistent and we do what we say we do. Habit tracking is a really great method to get yourself to take more action in future. So habit tracking basically is every time that you've engaged in a habit you wanted to, or not engaged in a habit you wanted to break, you kind of like tick that day and say, okay, I've managed to do this today. And if you see lots of days in a row of you having done that, that is actually really motivating. And what's really interesting about motivation, most people think that we need motivation in order to take action. However, it takes a long time for us to feel motivated, and it's difficult to rely on motivation. We actually can't rely on motivation because motivation, as any other emotion, comes and goes. And therefore, waiting for motivation to take action isn't a good idea, but also because taking action actually makes us more motivated, and that's due to something that we call self-efficacy in psychology. So self-efficacy basically means that you notice that you've managed to do something that you wanted to do, and you feel proud about that, and you feel also more competent and more confident that you will be able to do so in future. And because we feel more confident, we feel more ready to take action in future. And also we all love to feel confident. So confident is also a way for rewarding ourselves for the habit that we actually engaged in. And it's also great for building an identity or having a self-image that you want to have. And this is also really important because, as I've mentioned, we want to feel that we are living in alignment with who we think we are. And because of that, for example, there was a study that found that smokers who, when they were offered a cigarette and wanted to stop, who said, "No, thank you, I'm trying to quit smoking," they still identify as a smoker, and therefore they actually are more likely to smoke in future. Whereas those who said, "No, thank you, I'm not a smoker," identified as someone who doesn't smoke, and therefore it was easier for them to resist smoking in future. And then the fifth tip would be that we need very concrete triggers in order for us to actually take actions. And one great trigger would be what Stanford Professor B.J. Fogg would be a method by Stanford Professor B.J. Fogg, which is basically just combining two habits. You're combining a new habit you want to build with a habit that already exists in your life. You basically use the habit that you've already built as a trigger for the new habit you want to build. And this is also really effective because the author of The Power of Habit mentioned in his book that there are 5 triggers that are especially common. And one of them is the preceding action. So basically, the habit you do before the next habit can serve as a really powerful trigger. And by the way, just in case you want to know, the other 4 very common triggers are the location where you're at, the people you're surrounded by, the time at which you do that habit, and the emotion that you feel before you engage in that habit. And James Clear used this knowledge in his own life. He wanted to do more push-ups. Therefore, he said, every time in my lunch break, I am going to do a couple of push-ups. He thought this was a great idea. However, it actually wasn't that effective because the trigger wasn't concrete enough. Because in his lunch break, he didn't say exactly when he was going to do it in his lunch break. He just said, sometime in this time span, I'm going to do some push-ups. However, when he then made it more concrete, it actually worked really well. Now, if you want to know more tips for building good habits, you can watch this video by Casey Milkman here.